All righty. Well, this is Angela D. Joseph, and I am talking with Dr. Richard Joseph, who happens to be my brother. And it's interesting because my Shiro is my mother. My mother's name is Pearl. She was born on the island of Tobago in the West Indies. And this is a woman who grew up little, but she always gave everything that she had away. She always shared everything she had. My mother was a giver, and she gave regardless of her circumstances. And one summer in the 60s, I remember very well that my mother got letters from Mississippi from a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer. And of course, we've come to know Fannie Lou Hamer as one of the icons of the civil rights movement. And my mother befriended Mrs. Hamer because her son, Richard, was there in Mississippi with Mrs. Hamer. And my mother sent care packages down to Mississippi for Mrs. Hamer and gave to her to take care of her. And that's a little known piece of history from our family. But I wanted to talk to my brother today to find out his recollections of Fannie Lou Hamer. So Richard, welcome. Thank you for being a part of Women of Color Roar. Mrs. Hamer certainly is a hero. So tell us a little bit about you. What's your background?
Well, I was born in Trinidad and came with you and our two brothers to the United States in September of 1958. And then I went on to Dartmouth College. I went to high school in Brooklyn, New York, went on to college at Dartmouth, and then went overseas, got a couple of scholarships, a Fulbright, a Rhodes Scholarship, and became engaged in the civil rights movement about my second year at Dartmouth. And so met Mrs. Hamer at Dartmouth when she visited. It was an amazing experience. Unfortunately, many people were not taking notes and keeping documents, so we have to go hunt everything up, but I know it was a tremendous experience. I communicated with her at various times. Again, all of those letters are going to be assembled, but I definitely saw Mrs. Hamer again in Washington, D.C. in 1965, when I volunteered immediately after graduation to work with an organization that was put together by a Mississippi lawyer named Bill Hicks. And a number of college students and myself, we worked there that summer. I remember me meeting Mrs. Hamer, having some exchanges with her. But anyway, fast forward to 1967, I had completed a year in France and then a year in Oxford. And all I wanted to do, quite frankly, was just get to the front lines, get my SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee coveralls on me, and and get to work. And so I was able to do that this summer, several weeks in Mississippi with Mrs. Hamer.
Okay, now for somebody to have personal time with Mrs. Hamer, I know it's a long time ago, but tell us a little bit about Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. Like, what was she like? Was she loud? Was she quiet? What was she like?
Mrs. Hamer was just absolutely an amazing person. When we use the term, force of nature, Mrs. Hamer was a natural leader. It turns out that last night I was reading an essay by a Buddhist teacher. Her name is Judith Leaf, and the title was The Big Hug. And she talked about magnanimity and even about the term Mahatma, which we associate with Gandhi. Now, Mahatma, it turns out it means greatness of the soul. And everything that she was saying there, the big hug, the generosity, it was just like she was talking about Mrs. Hamer. This was just an amazing woman. When you think of where she came out of, how limited her formal education was, the poverty that she experienced, and the fact that she was able to function at such different levels, right? All the way up from, speaking out to Lyndon Johnson, speaking out to the national, all different levels. Now, I was able to sit with Mrs. Hamer most evenings when I was there and just talk and listen to her and just have her convey to us. Now, one point I want to make, when you mention about my mother, our mother communicating with Mrs. Hamer, I did not know that. But you said something here again when you mentioned about the care package. Because one of the first things I did when I got to Mississippi, quite frankly, it was extreme poverty. This is the thing, I have spoken to it on a number of occasions. The extreme poverty of people in Mississippi. Seeing people dressed the way they were, the malnourishment. You can't even call what they lived in houses. You know, the absence, I mean, all of the things that so many of us take for granted wasn't present. And we're talking about where so much wealth had emerged. And so immediately I was really gonna just get to work on it. In fact, I started off doing relief work when I was there. And so even after I have a letter from Mrs. Hamer, and one of the things she said in her letter is after I left, she says, oh, by the way, some more boxes had arrived. Because I was arranging food drives and clothing drives. And then Mrs. Hamer and I would talk, and we would really talk about the economic dimension. So anyway, I want to just say to you that, but Mrs. Hamer, there's a person named Charles McLaurin from Smith, from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who was sent to Ruleville in 1962 and met Mrs. Hamer. And he talked about sharing his experiences, and he referred to Mrs. Hamer as really being like a mother. And this is it. You know, if I had any term in terms of our personal relationship, Mrs. Hamer really became like a mother, you know, and being like a son. So the fact that our mothers were in connection, I could tell you your two sheroes were very much connected in that way. But one last thing I have to say, when you're saying about, you know, and I'm going to, you know, you've gotten me now to get into that work. And one of the things is Mrs. Hamer, she has still not gotten as much of the recognition as she should have. There's absolutely no issue that we're dealing with today. I mean, right now, the whole issue of voting rights. And we just heard that Vice President Kamala Harris has been assigned to take off that, right? So we're dealing with HR 1 and Mrs. Hamer. We're also dealing with the inequities, all the great, I mean, all the wealth gap. Every major issue we're seeing today, you can trace that back to that amazing woman. Thank you.
Well, yes. And when we think about Ms. Hamer, we think about that famous speech she made at the Democratic Convention. And that was preempted by President Johnson and ended up in the nightly news. And that is where people got to see. And, you know, the power of media is so important. And as you're saying that Mrs. Hamer didn't get, you know, what she should have had in terms of the many things she was involved in. But here we are today talking about Ms. Hamer and celebrating Ms. Hamer. And I think that's what's important about Women of Color Roar, because, you know, we're using this opportunity to educate about these women in our past. And also talk about how we take what they did and make it work for us going forward. So we're still fighting the battle. You see what's going on with Stacey Abrams down in Georgia, and so many people fighting still for our voting rights.
Yeah, and permit me to add, you know, Shirley Weber, your Secretary of State, you know, and the fact that she is really leading the struggle there now in that position for the reparations bill. I mean, and this is just so fundamentally, you know, what Mrs. Hamer was really looking at. That voting rights was important, all the struggles to get the vote, but you were dealing with such incredible disparities. In fact, Mississippi, when I get to Mississippi in 1967, the word, in addition to extreme poverty, is terror. This place continued to be ruled by terror. And remember, in that same county, just 10 miles away from Mrs. Hamer's house in Ruleville, was the plantation of Senator James Eastland. And Senator James Eastland was in the Senate all those years. This was a man who, in fact, headed up the Senate Judiciary Committee. And all the legislation that had to go through, having to do with basic rights, was really coming through Eastland's committee. And this man, you know, they said, you know, wherever you looked around, Eastland owned, right? And so the extraordinary disparities that we have there. And now we're just gradually beginning to address it in very serious ways. All right, so that's what I was living with Mrs. Hamer and being with this woman from such conditions and so on, and who emerged when the original civil rights workers met her and her courage. I mean, there's this story about them going to try to vote. The clerk didn't show up, so they had to go next door. And then on the bus coming back, I mean, the people were just scared. I know it. I've been on those roads. And Mrs. Hamer started singing. And that's one thing about Mrs. Hamer. You know, you can be talking to her, and all of a sudden, she'll just start singing to you. I mean, it's, you know, like I said, I am now getting into being able to relate, to connect. But this woman, you know, I would, you know, if they give posthumous, you know, Medals of Freedom Award, whatever it is, and maybe we have a vice president there, the time might have come for us to really honor this amazing woman. Thank you.
Well, one of the things I want to say is about her bravery, because she talks about being taken and being beaten, being to leave her job in the middle of the night because she registered to vote and she would not go take that back. So was she afraid for her life during that time?
Mrs., you know, I have said this elsewhere, our civil rights leaders, because I was in Montgomery, Selma Montgomery March, and I've spoken about leading, you know, because we were getting people, trying to get people to register to vote while everything was going on. But I could remember this moment of actually seeing the marches coming down and having seen these people driving around with their pickup trucks, right, with their shotguns on the back, you know, for the past week. This was the situation we were in, so the vulnerability that they faced. As you know, my other great man in my life is Malcolm X, and I'll be talking about some of the connection between Malcolm X. And I was able to host Malcolm X at Dartmouth in January 1965, my senior year, right? And here it is, about 5 weeks later, it's a picture of Malcolm X sprawled out, shot. Well, you know, that experience of being with him there and, you know, just the risk that they faced. Well, with Mrs. Hamer, it's like there's no protection. I mean, whether it is the police, whether it's the night riders, whether it's the so-called courts, you couldn't call them courts, but it's the utter vulnerability. And Mrs. Hamer would not be deterred. And those of us who interacted with her, as with other civil rights workers, you know, basically it almost, you know, emanated among you. And of course with the people. Because if the people facing such vulnerability were able to, remember, anytime you do anything, you step forward, your job could be gone. Your insurance could be cut off, right? The whole system was one in which that Black population was just totally dependent on the structures that be. And yet they were not deterred. I mean, it's just, you know, I mean, I have, as you know, I spend a lot of time on Africa. So I deal with a lot of African leaders. And I've dealt with a lot of, you know, African, people, you know, fighting for their rights and all the rest. But in the case of Mississippi, and not only Mississippi, the Delta, and not only the Delta, Sunflower County. Sunflower County was really considered just one of the hardest, toughest places to be in, to work with, to try to make progress. And Mrs. Hamer was right in the center of that. By the time I got there, because, you know, not only did I interact with Mrs. Hamer, I interacted a lot with her husband, Terry Hamer. They call him Pap Hamer. And Pap Hamer, I used to get in the car with Pap Hamer, and we used to drive around rural Mississippi. Pap Hamer knew where all the good places to get corn liquor was. Let me just tell you. and corn liquor is just one of the vilest things you ever want to drink. But anyway, and so I was able to really get to see the conditions of the people at a very basic level. Not only because of Mrs. Hamer Barulville, but because Perry Hamer and I had traveled a lot of the roads of rural Sunflower County and Mississippi. So that's another thing to share with you.
Well, that is quite a story. And let me say that, you know, Women of Color War, we honor women warriors, and certainly Mrs. Hamer needs a special award for that. And the fact that, you know, we're honoring today, we honored Park Cannon from
Yes.
Georgia, the representative there, who simply knocked on the door of her governor, and they were signing that, that voter suppression law, and she knocked on the door and was taken away in handcuffs. So,
Right.
she received our Women Warrior Award this year, and of course Stacey Abrams for her work. So it continues, it continues. But I wanted to talk to you today because I felt it was important that we think about our heroes from the past, the present, and then we have young people watching today, and we want them to understand that they have to take the baton and continue on. So, so Richard, I want to thank you for joining me today in this conversation, and we got to keep it going.
Okay, sweetheart, to have my sister, this is just wonderful. I know our mother, she's just looking down and she's just smiling on this moment. And as I promised you, it's taken me a while, but you got me to open up that door, and the door is open. And I'm really promising you all that I have now a lot that I'm going to bring forward from that period. And at the center of it being going to that moment in time, that place, and experiencing what I did with one of the most incredible women of the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.